The winter of 1965 came to Chicago like a judgment, cold, unforgiving, and absolute. Snow fell in thick curtains over the south side, muffling the sound of car engines and footsteps, turning the city into a monochrome portrait of ice and shadow. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through wool coats and brick buildings alike, whistling through alleyways where men conducted business that daylight would never touch. Tommy Marino stood in one such alley, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. He wore a charcoal overcoat, tailored but not flashy, and leather gloves that kept his hands warm and his fingerprints absent. At 32, Tommy carried himself with the controlled grace of a man who understood that survival depended on discipline. His face was unremarkable, clean-shaven with soft brown eyes that women once called gentle and men learned too late to fear. The target was a loan shark named Paulie Vespucci, a loud-mouthed operator who'd been skimming from the outfit's South Side collections. Tommy had watched Paulie for 3 days, learning his patterns, identifying the moments of vulnerability. Tonight, Paulie would leave his girlfriend's apartment on Halsted Street at 11:15, walk 2 blocks to his Cadillac and never make it home. Tommy checked his watch. 11:12. The Beretta M1951 sat comfortable in his shoulder holster, a familiar weight he'd carried for 6 years. He didn't think about the mechanics of what came next. The approach, the shot, the walk away. These movements had become as automatic as breathing, performed with the same calm efficiency that once made him the finest soprano in St. Adalbert's choir. That was another life. Before his father's gambling debts. Before Frank Giancana noticed a young man who could keep his mouth shut and his hands steady. Before Tommy learned that some talents transfer easier than others, that the same focus required to hit a perfect high C could be applied to hitting a man's heart from 20 feet away. At 11:14, the apartment door opened. Paulie emerged, buttoning his camel hair coat, his breath reeking of whiskey and cheap cigars even from a distance. He was alone. Good. Tommy waited until Paulie reached the middle of the block, then stepped from the alley's mouth. "Paulie," Tommy said quietly. The loan shark turned, confusion flickering across his fleshy face before recognition set in, then fear. "Tommy, wait, I can explain," the Beretta whispered twice. Paulie crumpled into the snow, which began immediately to bloom red around his body. Tommy walked over, confirmed the kill with the practiced eye of a professional, then melted back into the shadows. The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds. No witnesses, no complications. But as Tommy walked the 4 blocks to his car, something felt different. Usually after a job, he experienced a kind of hollow calm, the satisfaction of a task completed, a problem solved. Tonight, though, his chest felt tight. His hands trembled slightly as he started the engine. He drove not toward his apartment in Bridgeport, but south, toward Pilsen, where St. Adalbert stood like a Gothic ghost against the winter sky. The church had been built in 1914 by Polish immigrants, its twin spires once dominating the neighborhood skyline. Now in 1965, the parish was dying. The congregation had dwindled to mostly elderly women who lit candles for sons fighting in Vietnam and daughters who'd married outside the faith. The archdiocese talked about closing it down, selling the property to developers who'd tear it down for apartment buildings. Tommy parked on the street, studying the church's facade. Most of the stained glass windows had been boarded up after vandals smashed them. The front steps were cracked, the iron railings rusted. But the door was always unlocked. Father O'Reilly insisted on that. Even as the neighborhood changed around them, inside, the church was dark except for the perpetual lamp burning near the tabernacle and a handful of votive candles flickering in their red glass holders. The smell of incense and old wood and something else, decay perhaps, or just the accumulation of decades, filled Tommy's lungs. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he walked past rows of empty pews toward the confessional booth in the left transept. The confessional was older than the church itself, brought over from Ireland according to parish legend. Its dark wood was carved with Celtic crosses and worn smooth by generations of hands. Tommy entered the penitent's side, kneeling on the cushion that had long ago lost its padding. Through the screen, he could see the vague outline of Father O'Reilly. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Tommy began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been 3 days since my last confession. Tommy." Father O'Reilly's voice was thick with exhaustion and whiskey. "You shouldn't keep coming here. It's not safe. For either of us. I need to confess, Father. That's what you're here for, isn't it?" A long silence. "Then tell me, tonight, Southside, a man named Paulie Vespucci. 2 shots, center mass, clean, quick." Tommy's voice remained steady, almost clinical. He was a loan shark. Stealing from the organization? Someone had to do it. Someone. Father O'Reilly let out a bitter laugh. "And that someone is always you, isn't it, Tommy? How many now? How many souls have you sent to judgment?" 17, Tommy said. "Not counting the war." Father Sean O'Reilly was 63 years old with white hair and trembling hands that betrayed both his age and his drinking. He'd baptized Tommy Marino 32 years ago, taught him to serve Mass, trained his voice in the choir. He'd watched the boy's father drink himself to death, seen the mother work 3 jobs to keep food on the table, witnessed young Tommy's transformation from altar boy to altar of sacrifice. The first time Tommy came to confess a murder, Father O'Reilly had wept. That was 6 years ago. Now he simply listened, bound by the seal of confession, a sacred trust that prohibited him from revealing anything heard in the sacrament, even to save lives. Even to save his own soul. "You can't keep doing this," Father O'Reilly said. "This isn't confession, Tommy. This is... I don't know what this is. But it's not bringing you absolution." "Then what will?" Tommy asked. "I do what I'm told. I provide for my mother. I don't hurt innocents. I follow the rules." "Whose rules? God's or Frank Giancana's?" Tommy didn't answer. Through the screen, he watched Father O'Reilly's silhouette lean forward. "For your penance," the priest said, his voice hollow. "Say 3 Hail Marys. And Tommy, pray for the grace to stop, before it's too late." "Too late for what, Father?" "For your soul, for mine, for all of us." Tommy left the confessional and walked to the votive candles. He lit one, he always did after confession, and dropped a $5 bill in the collection box. More than most parishioners gave in a month, he knew. The flame guttered in the draft from somewhere, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As he turned to leave, Tommy noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small photograph tucked into the frame of the crucifix near the door. It showed the church's youth choir from 1948, 17 years ago, 17 boys in white surplices standing in neat rows. Tommy found himself in the back row, skinny, gap-toothed, eyes bright with something that might have been innocence or might have been ambition. He stared at that boy for a long moment, trying to remember what it felt like to be him. To believe that singing hymns could save you, to think that goodness was rewarded and evil punished, to not know that sometimes the only difference between the two was who gave the orders. The door creaked open behind him. Tommy's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he recognized the intruder. Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly Polish woman who came every evening to pray the rosary. She nodded at him, her roomy eyes kind, and shuffled toward her usual pew. Tommy nodded back and left, stepping into the winter night. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped further. His breath hung in the air like evidence of something, life maybe, or guilt, or just the simple fact of existing when 17 other men no longer did. He drove home through empty streets, past closed storefronts and bars spilling yellow light onto icy sidewalks. His apartment was in a 3-flat on Low Avenue, modest but clean. His mother lived on the first floor. He'd bought the building 2 years ago, told her he'd saved up from his job at the meatpacking plant. She believed him, or pretended to, which amounted to the same thing. Inside his apartment, Tommy poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and sat by the window, watching snow begin to fall again. Somewhere in the city, Paulie Vespucci's body was being discovered. Somewhere, police were being called, evidence being collected, reports being filed, and somewhere Frank Giancana was sleeping soundly. One problem eliminated, the machine of organized crime running smoothly. Tommy thought about Father O'Reilly's question, what would bring absolution? He'd been asking himself the same thing for 6 years. The confessions didn't help, he knew that now. They were just a ritual he'd developed, a way to pretend that there were still rules, that someone was keeping score, that his actions mattered to something larger than the outfit's profit margins. He finished his bourbon and went to bed, but sleep was slow to come. When it did, he dreamed of the church, not as it was now, decaying and forgotten, but as it had been in his childhood. The stained glass windows whole and radiant, casting colored light across packed pews, the choir singing, their voices rising toward the vaulted ceiling, and Tommy in the front row, his mouth open in song, his heart light, his hands clean. He woke at dawn, and the dream dissolved like snow in sunshine, but the feeling it left behind, a longing for something he couldn't name, stayed with him as he dressed, as he called his mother to check on her, as he waited for Frank's call with the next assignment. The call came at 9:30. There was a problem on the north side, a witness who needed to be silenced. Tommy listened to the details, memorized the address, hung up the phone, and began the process of becoming someone who could do what needed to be done. The north side job was supposed to be simple. A bookkeeper named Arthur Klein who'd seen too much and was scheduled to testify before a grand jury. Klein lived alone in a walk-up on Sheffield Avenue, worked late hours, kept to himself. Frank's intelligence said Klein had no family, no girlfriend, no complications. Tommy spent 2 days confirming the intelligence. He watched Klein leave his apartment each morning at 7:45, briefcase in hand, return each evening around 6:30. The man had a routine more rigid than a monk's. Same route to the L, same seat in the same car, same newspaper purchased from the same vendor. It would be easy to take him on the walk home, in the narrow passage between his building and the vacant lot next door. On the third night, Tommy positioned himself in the vacant lot, concealed behind a rusted dumpster. February darkness came early, and by 6 o'clock the street was already deep in shadow. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees and the wind off the lake felt like knives. Tommy's breath came in short, controlled bursts. He wore dark clothing, a watch cap pulled low, the Beretta ready in his coat pocket. At 6:28, Klein turned the corner onto Sheffield. Tommy watched him approach, noted the tired slump of his shoulders, the way he clutched his briefcase like a shield. The bookkeeper was 47 years old, balding, unremarkable in every way except for what he knew about the outfit's financial operations. Klein passed the vacant lot. Tommy stepped from concealment, falling into step behind him. The street was empty. Everyone sensible was inside, away from the cold. At the passage entrance, Tommy called out, "Mr. Klein." The bookkeeper turned, startled. His eyes widened with recognition, not of Tommy specifically, but of what Tommy represented. He opened his mouth to scream. Tommy's hand emerged from his pocket, the Beretta raised. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then a child ran into the passage. A boy, maybe 8 years old, wearing a blue winter coat too thin for the weather. He was laughing, running from someone, a game, Tommy's mind registered, and he ran directly between Tommy and Klein at the exact moment Tommy fired. The bullet caught the boy in the chest. He fell backward, his laughter transforming into a gasp of surprise more than pain. Behind him, Klein screamed and ran. Tommy stood frozen, the gun still raised, watching blood spread across the boy's blue coat like spilled ink. A woman's voice, high, terrified. "Michael. Michael." Tommy's training kicked in. He holstered the gun and ran, not after Klein but away. Away from the boy named Michael, away from the woman's screams, away from what he'd just done. He ran 3 blocks before forcing himself to slow to a walk, to become just another man hurrying through the cold evening. His car was parked on Halsted. Tommy got in, started the engine with trembling hands, drove carefully, not too fast, nothing to attract attention, toward Bridgeport. His mind was screaming, but his body operated on autopilot, executing the protocols he'd developed. Change clothes, dispose of the gun, establish an alibi. But something was broken. As he drove, Tommy saw the boy's face. That moment of surprise, not understanding yet that he was dying. 8 years old, blue coat, playing a game. Tommy pulled over and vomited into the gutter. When he could drive again, he went not to his apartment but to St. Adalbert's. It was 8 o'clock. The evening mass had just ended and the last few parishioners were leaving. Tommy waited in his car until the church was empty, then went inside. The church was darker than usual. Half the lights didn't work anymore, and Father O'Reilly rarely bothered fixing them. Tommy walked directly to the confessional and entered, not bothering to check if the priest was even there. He was. Tommy could hear him breathing on the other side of the screen, could smell the whiskey. "Father," Tommy said, his voice breaking. "Father, something went wrong. There was a boy. I didn't see him. He just ran out and I'd already pulled the trigger and, whoa, stop. Father O'Reilly's voice was sharp, more alert than Tommy had heard it in years. Don't tell me this. Tommy, for the love of God, don't tell me this. I have to confess. You need to turn yourself in. The priest's voice was trembling now. A child, Tommy, you killed a child. There's no absolution for this. There's no penance that can. It was an accident. Was it? Was pulling that trigger an accident? Was going there with a loaded gun an accident? Father O'Reilly's silhouette leaned close to the screen. How many times have I heard your confessions? How many times have I given you absolution while knowing that you'd go out and do it again? I've been complicit in 17 murders, Tommy. 17 and now a child. What do you want me to do? Tommy asked. Tell me what to do, Father. A long silence. Then, I don't know. I don't know anymore. I've been asking God for guidance for 6 years and all I hear is silence. Or maybe I'm too drunk to hear his voice. Maybe I damned myself the first time I gave you absolution without requiring you to stop, to turn yourself in, to face judgment. The seal of confession. Damn the seal. Father O'Reilly's voice cracked. What good is it if it protects murderers? If it makes me an accomplice? I became a priest to save souls. Tommy. But all I've done is watch yours slip away, confession by confession, killing by killing. Tommy heard movement on the other side. Father O'Reilly standing, stumbling slightly. The priest's door opened, and Tommy saw him emerge. White-haired, red-faced, tears streaming down his cheeks. I can't do this anymore, Father O'Reilly said. I can't hear another confession from you. I can't give you absolution. Not this time. Not ever again. He walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty church. Tommy remained kneeling in the confessional, staring through the screen at nothing. After a long time, he emerged. The church felt different now, colder, emptier, as if something essential had been removed. Tommy walked to the votive candles and lit one, as he always did. But his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the matches, scattering them across the marble floor. He knelt to pick them up and saw blood on his hands. Not real blood, he'd washed them. But he saw it anyway. The boy's blood, bright red against blue fabric. Michael's blood. Tommy left the matches where they were and walked out of the church. He drove aimlessly for hours, through neighborhoods he'd known all his life, but that now seemed foreign and hostile. Every street corner held memories, places he'd played as a child, fought as a teenager, killed as a man. The city that had made him was the city he'd helped corrupt, one bullet at a time. At midnight, he found himself on Lakeshore Drive, staring out at the frozen lake. Ice extended hundreds of yards from shore, gray and desolate under the winter moon. Tommy thought about walking out onto that ice, keeping walking until it cracked and swallowed him. Instead, he drove to a payphone and called Frank Giancana. It's done, Tommy lied. Klein won't be testifying. Good, Frank said. Clean? Yes, Tommy said, the word tasting like poison. Clean. He hung up and leaned against the phone booth, feeling the cold metal through his coat. In the distance, sirens wailed, police or an ambulance or a fire truck. The sounds of a city in constant crisis, constantly trying to save itself from itself. Tommy went home. His mother had left a note under his door. Made brisket. Come for dinner tomorrow. He crumpled the note and threw it away. The thought of sitting across from her, pretending to be a good son, pretending his hands weren't stained with the blood of a child he'd never even known, it was unbearable. He poured bourbon, then poured it down the sink. He needed to think clearly, to understand what had happened and what it meant. The boy's death was an accident, that was true. But Father O'Reilly was right. Pulling the trigger wasn't. Going there with a loaded gun wasn't. 17 murders weren't. Tommy had spent 6 years telling himself he was just following orders, just doing a job, just surviving in a world where you either killed or got killed. But that 8-year-old boy hadn't been part of that world. He'd just been playing a game, laughing, running through his neighborhood on a cold February night. And now he was dead because Tommy Marino existed. Tommy sat by the window until dawn, watching the city wake up. Deliverymen and factory workers, secretaries and shopkeepers all going about their lives, unaware that one of their children had been murdered in a Sheffield Avenue passage. Unaware that the man who killed him sat in a Bridgeport apartment, asking questions he should have asked 6 years ago. The morning newspaper confirmed what Tommy already knew. Boy, 8 killed in Northside shooting. Michael Brennan, 3rd grader at St. Clement's School, only child of Daniel and Catherine Brennan. The article mentioned that a witness, identity withheld, had seen the shooter flee, described him as medium height, dark clothing, possibly Italian or Irish. Arthur Klein had survived. He'd seen Tommy's face. The police would have a description. The FBI would get involved. Killing a child, even accidentally, brought heat that the outfit couldn't easily manage. Tommy was now a liability. His phone rang at 10 o'clock. Frank's voice, colder than the February wind. "We need to meet noon, the usual place." "Frank, listen. Noon, Tommy. Don't be late." The line went dead. Tommy knew what the usual place meant. A warehouse in Canaryville where the outfit conducted business that required privacy. He also knew what happened to liabilities who showed up to such meetings. He had 2 hours to decide, run or face the consequences. He thought about his mother, about the building he'd bought her, about all the lies he'd told to keep her from knowing what he really was. He thought about Father O'Reilly, drunk and despairing, the seal of confession breaking him as surely as it protected Tommy. He thought about 17 men who'd died by his hand, and one boy who'd died by his mistake. And he thought about redemption. Not the kind offered in confession, but the kind that required sacrifice. Real sacrifice. Not 3 Hail Marys and a promise to try harder next time. Tommy opened his closet and found the box he'd kept hidden for years. His old choir robes from St. Adalbert's, yellowed with age. He buried his face in the white fabric and smelled incense and innocence and everything he'd lost. Then he began to plan. Not his escape. Not his defense. But his penance. Tommy didn't go to the meeting in Canaryville. Instead, he went to the Newberry Library on Clark Street and spent the afternoon reading about fire, its symbolism in Christianity, its use in purification rituals, its role in divine judgment. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked if he was doing research for school. Tommy said yes and kept reading. Fire as punishment, fire as cleansing, fire as transformation, the burning bush that spoke to Moses, the tongues of flame at Pentecost, the lake of fire awaiting the unrighteous. Page after page, Tommy absorbed the knowledge, feeling something click into place in his mind. He couldn't undo what he'd done. Couldn't bring back Michael Brennan or any of the 17 men whose lives he'd ended. But he could offer them something, acknowledgement, witness, a kind of posthumous respect that his quick, efficient killings had denied them. Tommy left the library at closing time and drove to a religious supply store in Little Italy. He bought 24 rosaries, cheap wooden ones, the kind given to children making their first communion. The clerk, an elderly man who probably knew Tommy's mother from church, smiled and asked if he was teaching catechism classes now. "Something like that," Tommy said. That night he drove to Sheffield Avenue. Police tape still cordoned off the passage where Michael Brennan had died. A makeshift memorial had grown there. Teddy bears and candles and handwritten notes from classmates. "We miss you, Michael. Fly with the angels." Why did this happen? Tommy parked a block away and watched. At 11 o'clock, when the street was empty, he approached the memorial. From his pocket, he took one of the rosaries and laid it gently among the stuffed animals and flowers. The wooden beads gleamed dully in the streetlight. Then he knelt. Right there on the sidewalk in the cold February night, Tommy Marino knelt at the place where he'd killed an innocent child, and he prayed. Not the rote prayers of his childhood, not the mechanical recitations he'd mumbled after confession. Real prayer, honest, desperate, from whatever part of his soul remained uncorrupted. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Michael, I'm so sorry. I can't bring you back. I can't fix this. But I want you to know. I want everyone to know that I see what I did. I remember you. You matter." He stayed there for 10 minutes, aware that every moment increased the risk of being seen, being caught. But the risk felt appropriate, just he should be caught. He should face judgment. When he finally stood, his knees were numb from the cold concrete. He walked back to his car, drove home, and slept better than he had in years. The next morning, the newspaper reported the rosary. Police were baffled. Was it left by the killer? A witness? A mourner? The FBI agent heading the investigation, a man named Morrison, told reporters they were treating it as a significant development. Tommy read the article 3 times. feeling something he'd never felt after a killing: connection. The rosary was his signature, his confession, his way of saying, "I was here. This mattered. I cannot escape what I've done." For the next week, Tommy lived like a ghost in his own life. He avoided his mother, ignored calls from Frank's associates, stayed away from St. Adalbert's. The outfit was looking for him. He knew that. Klein had given the FBI a description. His face would be on wanted posters soon. The walls were closing in, but before they caught him, Tommy had work to do. He began visiting the sites of his previous killings. 17 locations scattered across Chicago's south and west sides, alleys and parking lots and quiet residential streets where men had died at his hand. At each location, Tommy left a rosary, and at each location he knelt and remembered. Paulie Vespucci shot in a Halsted Street alley. Tommy remembered Paulie's last words. "Wait, I can explain." What had Paulie wanted to explain? That he'd only stolen from the outfit because his daughter needed medical treatment? That he'd gambled away his legitimate income? That he was desperate? Tommy would never know. He'd never asked. He just pulled the trigger. Marco Giordano killed in a Cicero basement. Tony Calabrese shot in his car on Western Avenue. Vincent "Vinnie Knuckles" Russo found in a Pilsen dumpster. One by one, Tommy visited them all, leaving rosaries kneeling in the cold, remembering their faces at the moment of death. The newspapers picked up on the pattern. "Rosary Killer Memorializes Victims," read the Tribune headline. The FBI established a task force. Psychologists offered theories. The killer was religiously obsessed, guilt-ridden, possibly seeking to be caught. All true, Tommy thought. Detective Morrison gave a press conference. "This individual is clearly troubled and dangerous. We're asking anyone with information about these homicides, any of which may be connected to organized crime, to come forward. There may be a religious or Catholic connection to the perpetrator." The outfit noticed, too. Tommy's apartment was watched. His mother was questioned, gently because even the mob had some rules, but questioned nonetheless. She told them she hadn't seen her son in 2 weeks, which was true. She asked them to tell Tommy to call her, that she was worried, that she'd made his favorite meal. After leaving the 17th Rosary for Marco Giordano, Tommy drove to St. Adalbert's. It was late February now, and the snow had turned to rain, cold and miserable. The church looked worse than ever in the gray afternoon light, its boarded windows like empty eye sockets. Inside, Father O'Reilly was hearing confessions, or trying to. The confessional light was on, but no penitents waited. Tommy sat in a back pew and watched the old priest emerge after half an hour, his shoulders slumped, his face gray with exhaustion. Father O'Reilly didn't see Tommy at first. He went to the sacristy, and Tommy heard the sound of a bottle being opened. After a few minutes, the priest returned to the sanctuary, moving unsteadily, and began preparing for evening mass that no one would attend. "Father," Tommy said quietly. The priest spun around, nearly dropping the chalice he was holding. "Tommy, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, you scared me." "I'm sorry. You're sorry." Father O'Reilly set down the chalice and walked toward Tommy's pew. "Do you know what you've done? The police have been here twice. The FBI once, asking about you, about anyone matching your description, about whether I've seen you. What did you tell them?" "Nothing. What could I tell them? Everything I know came through confession." Father O'Reilly's voice cracked. "Everything I know is sealed by an oath I took 40 years ago. An oath that's destroying me." "Then break it," Tommy said. "Tell them everything. Give them my name, my address, everything." The priest stared at him. "I can't do that." "Why not?" "You said it yourself. The seal protects murderers, makes you complicit. So break it, save yourself, and damn my immortal soul." "Tommy, you don't understand. The seal of confession isn't just church law. It's sacred. It's inviolable. Even if it costs me everything, my peace, my sanity, my life, I cannot break it." "Then we're both trapped," Tommy said. Father O'Reilly sank into the pew beside him. Up close, the priest looked older than his 63 years. His hands trembled constantly now. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red. The smell of whiskey hung around him like a cloud. "Why are you here?" Father O'Reilly asked. "Why do you keep coming back to this place?" "Because it's the only place that feels real anymore," Tommy said. "Everything else, the outfit, the killings, even my own apartment feels like a stage set. Like I'm playing a role. But here Here I remember who I used to be. Before. You can't go back, Tommy. That boy you were, the choir boy, the altar server, he's gone. You killed him along with everyone else. I know, Tommy said. But maybe I can do one thing right before the end. One act of actual penance, not just words in a dark box. What are you talking about? Tommy told him. About the rosaries, about visiting each killing site, about the plan forming in his mind. Father O'Reilly listened, his face growing paler with each word. No, the priest said when Tommy finished. Absolutely not. I won't allow it. You can't stop me, Father. And honestly, I think part of you agrees with me. I think part of you has been waiting for this. You're not thinking clearly. The guilt is the only thing that's making me think clearly. Tommy stood. I've been confused for 6 years, Father. Confused about right and wrong, about duty and sin, about who I am and who I'm supposed to be. But for the first time since I pulled a trigger for Frank Giancana, I understand exactly what I need to do. He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. One more thing. In my apartment, there's a lockbox under the floorboards in the bedroom closet. Inside is money, $47,000. It's clean. Not from the outfit, from jobs I did on my own. I want you to give it to Michael Brennan's parents, anonymously. It won't bring him back, but maybe it'll help. Tommy, please, Father. It's the only thing I can do for that boy. Father O'Reilly nodded slowly, tears streaming down his weathered face. Tommy left the church and drove through the rainy afternoon. The city looked different to him now, clearer somehow, as if a fog had lifted. He saw its beauty and its brutality, its dreams and its compromises. He saw himself in it. Chicago and Tommy Marino, both built on violence, both seeking redemption they might not deserve. That night, he visited his mother's apartment. She opened the door and gasped, pulling him into a fierce hug. Where have you been? I've been so worried. Tommy, there are men looking for you, rough men. They won't tell me why, but... Ma, listen. Tommy held her by the shoulders, looking into her tired, loving eyes. I need you to know something. Whatever you hear about me in the next few days, whatever they say I've done, I need you to know that I love you. That everything I did because I thought I was protecting you. Tommy, you're scaring me. What's going on? I can't explain. Not yet, maybe not ever. But I need you to promise me something. When this is over, when you understand, I need you to forgive me. Can you do that? His mother's face crumpled. Of course. Of course I forgive you. You're my son. Whatever it is, whatever you've done, you're my son. They held each other for a long time. Tommy memorizing the feel of her arms around him, the smell of her lavender soap, the sound of her breathing. Then he kissed her forehead and left, ignoring her pleas to stay, to talk, to let her help. Tommy drove back to his apartment and spent the night preparing, writing letters, making arrangements, planning the final confession that would require no words, only fire. The last 2 weeks of Tommy Marino's freedom played out like a strange, haunted ritual. Each morning he woke before dawn and drove to a different church, not to confess but to observe. He watched early morning masses at Holy Name Cathedral, Our Lady of Sorrows, St. Stanislaus Kostka. He studied how light moved through stained glass, how smoke rose from incense, how priests elevated the Eucharist with trembling, reverent hands. He was learning about sacred spaces, about what it meant when something holy burned. The FBI was closing in. On March 3rd, Arthur Klein identified Tommy from a photo array. By March 5th, Tommy's face was on the front page of every Chicago newspaper. Northside killer identified Thomas Marino. 32, suspected mob hitman. The Tribune ran his choir photo from 1948 next to his police mugshot from a 1961 assault charge that outfit lawyers had made disappear. Tommy's mother gave an interview to the Sun-Times, tears streaming down her face. There's been a terrible mistake. My Tommy is a good boy. He works at the packing house. He sings in the church choir. He couldn't hurt anyone. Reading her words felt like being stabbed. Tommy wanted to call her to explain, but what could he say? Yes, Ma, I'm a killer. Yes, I've murdered 17 men and 1 boy. Yes, everything you believe about me is a lie. Better to let her keep her illusions until the end. The outfit made its position clear when 2 of Frank's enforcers showed up at Tommy's apartment. He wasn't there. He'd been sleeping in his car, moving locations each night. But the message was obvious. Tommy Marino was no longer protected. The organization that had used him for 6 years now considered him a problem to be eliminated. On March 10th, Tommy drove to Joliet and bought 20 gallons of gasoline. He stored the containers in his car's trunk, the smell of fuel overwhelming in the confined space. The hardware store clerk gave him a strange look but said nothing. It was Illinois in 1965. You minded your own business. That evening, Tommy visited St. Adalbert's for the last time as a free man. Father O'Reilly was hearing the confessions of 3 elderly women. Tommy waited in a back pew, watching candlelight flicker on the statues of saints. St. Anthony, St. Joseph, the Blessed Mother. They'd stood in this church for 50 years, silent witnesses to prayers and sins, faith and despair. Soon they'd witness something else. When the last woman finished her confession and left, Tommy entered the confessional. Through the screen he could see Father O'Reilly's profile, gaunt, exhausted, aged beyond his years. I came to say goodbye, Tommy said. Don't do this. Father O'Reilly replied immediately. Whatever you're planning, it's already done, Father. In my mind, it's already happened. I'm just waiting for reality to catch up. Fire is not redemption, Tommy. It's not sacrifice. It's just destruction. Maybe that's all I deserve. Tommy leaned close to the screen. You remember when I was 12? You told me I had the voice of an angel. You said God had given me a gift and I had to use it to glorify him. I remember. I wonder sometimes, if my father hadn't died, if we hadn't been so poor, if Frank Giancana hadn't noticed me, would I have used that gift differently? Would I be singing in some cathedral right now instead of... Tommy trailed off. But that's not how it works, is it? We don't get to see the other paths. Only the one we walked. Father O'Reilly was quiet for a long moment. Then, I failed you, Tommy. I failed you as a priest, as a spiritual father, as a man. When you came to me 6 years ago with that first confession, I should have refused absolution unless you turned yourself in. I should have found a way, within the bounds of the seal, to stop you. Instead, I took the easy path. I told myself I was bound by church law, that my hands were tied. But the truth is, I was a coward. I didn't want to lose you. You were like a son to me, and I couldn't bear the thought of sending you to prison. That's not your burden to carry, Father, isn't it? I heard 17 confessions of murder, 18 counting the boy. I gave you absolution each time, knowing you'd go back out and kill again. How many of those deaths are on my conscience? How much blood is on my hands? All of it, Tommy said gently. All the blood is on my hands, Father. Not yours, mine. Through the screen, Tommy saw the priest's shoulders shake with sobs. After all these years of holding it together, of maintaining the appearance of spiritual authority, while drowning in whiskey and despair, Father O'Reilly was finally breaking. I wanted to save you, the priest said through his tears. That's all I ever wanted. To save your soul. Maybe you did, Tommy said. Maybe that's what all of this has been. My salvation, just not the kind either of us expected. Not through prayer or penance, but through fire. Through finally accepting what I am and what I deserve. That's not salvation. That's damnation. Maybe they're the same thing. Maybe that's what I've been learning. Tommy stood to leave. Father O'Reilly's voice stopped him. When? Tonight. After midnight, when the neighborhood's asleep. I'll call the police. I'll tell them. You won't, Tommy said. Because you can't. The seal binds you, remember? Everything I just told you falls under confession. You can't reveal it, not even to save the church. Not even to save me. Father O'Reilly's anguished silence confirmed it. The very law he'd hidden behind for 6 years now prevented him from stopping what was coming. I'm sorry, Father, Tommy said, for everything. For the burden I placed on you. For twisting your faith into something that hurt you. For making you complicit. You deserved a better penitent. And you deserved a better priest. Tommy left the confessional and walked through the church one last time. He ran his hand along the pews where he'd sat as a child. He stood at the altar where he'd served Mass, holding the missal for Father O'Reilly while the priest consecrated bread and wine. He touched the choir loft railing where he'd stood for Christmas Eve services, his voice soaring up to the vaulted ceiling. All of it would be gone by morning. At the door, Tommy turned back. Father O'Reilly had emerged from the confessional and stood in the center aisle watching him. I'll pray for you, the priest said. Every day for the rest of my life, I'll pray for your soul. Thank you, Father. But pray for Michael Brennan instead. And for all the others, they need it more than I do. Tommy walked out into the March night. The temperature had risen slightly, hovering around freezing rather than the bitter cold of February. Spring was coming, though you couldn't tell it from the gray sky and dirty snow piled along the streets. He drove to his mother's building but didn't go inside. He just sat in his car, watching her windows, the warm light spilling out into the darkness. She was probably watching television or knitting or reading her prayer book, living her simple, honest life while her son prepared to become something else. Not Tommy Marino the man, but Tommy the choir boy, the symbol, the story, the cautionary tale. At 11:30 p.m., Tommy returned to St. Adalbert's. The church was dark and locked. Tommy used the key he'd stolen years ago, kept it all this time, a talisman of the boy he'd been. The lock turned easily and he slipped inside. The church was silent except for the creak of old wood and the distant sound of traffic. Tommy stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The perpetual lamp still burned near the tabernacle, its red glow the only light. He went to work methodically. From his car, he brought in the gasoline containers and began soaking the wooden pews. The smell was overwhelming, chemical, and harsh. He splashed fuel on the confessional where he'd told his sins, on the altar where he'd served Mass, on the choir loft where he'd sung hymns to a God he'd slowly stopped believing in. As he worked, Tommy sang, softly at first, then louder, Panis Angelicus, the hymn he'd performed for his confirmation. His voice, unused for years except in confession, cracked at first, then found its strength. The Latin words echoed in the empty church, and for a moment Tommy was 12 again, innocent and full of faith. When every surface was soaked, Tommy returned to the center aisle. From his pocket he took out the last rosary, the 18th, saved for himself. He hung it around his neck, feeling the wooden beads against his chest. Then he took out the matchbook he'd been carrying for 2 weeks. Tommy stood there, match in hand, and thought about all the lives that had led to this moment. Michael Brennan, running through Sheffield Avenue, laughing at a game. The 17 men he'd killed, each with their own stories, their own families, their own sins and redemptions cut short by his bullets. Father O'Reilly destroyed by a sacred law he couldn't break. His mother, who would wake tomorrow to the news that her son had burned with the church that baptized him. And himself, Tommy Marino, born 1933, died 1965. The choir boy, the killer who confessed every murder, the man who couldn't find absolution in prayer and sought it in fire. Forgive me, Tommy whispered, to God, to his victims, to himself. He struck the match. The flame was small at first, almost delicate. Tommy watched it burn toward his fingers, mesmerized by its simplicity. Fire was honest, at least. It consumed everything equally, made no distinction between the righteous and the damned. Tommy dropped the match. The gasoline ignited with a roar that seemed to shake the church's foundation. Flames raced along the pews, up the walls, across the altar. Within seconds, the entire church was ablaze. Heat washed over Tommy like a physical force, and smoke began to fill the space. He should run. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But Tommy stayed, standing in the center aisle, watching his childhood burn. The stained glass windows, the few that remained, shattered from the heat, sending colored shards falling like rain. The crucifix above the altar blackened and began to fall. The confessional where he'd whispered his sins collapsed into ash. The rosary around Tommy's neck grew hot, then hotter. The wooden beads scorched his skin. Still he stayed, breathing smoke, feeling fire lick at his clothes. Through the roar of flames, Tommy heard sirens. Someone had seen the fire, called it in. The fire department was coming, the police, the FBI. Everyone would come to watch St. Adalbert's die, and they would find Tommy Marino's body in the ruins, along with 18 rosaries, one at each site of murder, one around his neck. The newspapers would report it. The FBI would close their case. The outfit would be relieved. His mother would grieve, and Father O'Reilly would finally be free from the burden of Tommy's confessions, the seal of secrecy broken by death. Tommy's lungs burned. his vision blurred from smoke and heat. The ceiling was collapsing, timber and plaster crashing down around him. He should be terrified, but instead he felt only peace. Not the hollow calm that followed his killings, but genuine peace. The certainty that he was, for once, doing the right thing. The confessional's screen glowed red-hot, then disintegrated. Tommy remembered kneeling there, whispering his crimes, seeking absolution he didn't deserve. Well, here was his final confession. I am Tommy Marino. I killed 18 people. I cannot be forgiven. But I can be remembered. I can be a warning. I can be the story told to young men considering the life I chose, the story of how that life ends, not in glory or wealth or power, but in fire and ash and regret. A section of roof fell directly toward him. Tommy closed his eyes and began to sing one last time. Panis Angelicus fit panis hominum. The voice of an angel, Father O'Reilly had said. Had he ever had that? Or had it always been illusion, a pleasant sound masking something rotten underneath? It didn't matter now. The roof struck and everything went bright, then dark. 3 blocks away, Father Sean O'Reilly stood in the street watching St. Adalbert's burn. Firefighters swarmed around the building, but it was already too late. The entire structure was engulfed, flames shooting 50 feet into the night sky. The priest had known, of course. Tommy's confession had told him everything, and the seal prevented him from warning anyone. So he'd simply walked here and waited, watching the church of his life's ministry consumed by fire. Father O'Reilly? A fireman approached. You're the priest here, right? Was anyone inside? The seal of confession bound him absolutely, but Tommy was dead. The seal ended at death. And even if it didn't, Father O'Reilly was done hiding behind sacred law. Yes, the priest said. Thomas Marino. He was inside. He did this. The killer? The mob hitman? Yes. But also, Father O'Reilly's voice broke. Also a boy I baptized. A choir boy. A soul I failed to save. Police surrounded the burning church. FBI agents arrived. Detective Morrison stood beside Father O'Reilly, watching the flames. We've been looking for Marino for weeks, Morrison said. Guess he decided to save us the trouble. It wasn't about you, Father O'Reilly said quietly. It was about him. About finding a penance that matched his sins. Burning down a church? That's not penance. That's insanity. Maybe, the priest agreed. Or maybe it's the only honest thing he ever did. They found Tommy's body the next morning, when the fire had cooled enough to search. He was in the center aisle, exactly where he'd stood at his first communion. The rosary around his neck had burned into his flesh. In his pockets, investigators found a list of names and locations, all 17 murder victims with precise details. Tommy's final confession, written down for the law since he could no longer give it to his priest. The newspapers ran the story for weeks. Mob hitman's final confession written in flames. The choir boy who burned with his sins. Psychologists analyzed Tommy's motives. Theologians debated whether self-immolation constituted penance or presumption. The FBI closed 18 homicide cases. Tommy's mother died 3 months later. The doctor said heart attack, but everyone knew it was grief. She was buried beside her son in Mount Carmel Cemetery. Father O'Reilly performed the funeral mass, his hands shaking, his voice barely audible. The archdiocese demolished what remained of St. Adalbert's. Within 2 years, luxury apartments stood on the site. The Polish neighborhood dispersed. The old church, and the man who burned it, became a footnote in Chicago's violent history. But Father O'Reilly never forgot. He left the priesthood 6 months after the fire, unable to continue serving in a role he felt he'd betrayed. He spent his remaining years, he died in 1973, volunteering at homeless shelters and addiction centers, trying to save the souls he'd failed to save before. In his sparse apartment, he kept one artifact, a partially melted rosary recovered from St. Adalbert's ruins. Not the one Tommy wore. That had been buried with him. But one of the others, found in the debris. Father O'Reilly wasn't sure which murder victim it represented. It didn't matter. It represented all of them, all the confessions he'd heard and absolved, all the deaths he'd been powerless to prevent. On the 8th anniversary of the fire, Father O'Reilly sat in his small room and wrote a final account of Tommy Marino's story. Not for publication. The seal still bound him even in Tommy's death, even in his own departure from active ministry. But for himself, to understand, to remember, to acknowledge that the line between salvation and damnation, between sacred duty and moral cowardice was thinner than any theological text admitted. He ended his account with a question he'd been asking since that March night in 1965. Had Tommy found redemption in the flames? Had his final, terrible penance been accepted by a God who promised mercy to the repentant? Father O'Reilly didn't know. He suspected he'd never know, not in this life. But sometimes, late at night, he thought he heard singing, a clear young voice rising in Latin hymns, the voice of a choir boy who'd lost his way and found it again, briefly in fire and confession, and the terrible honesty of self-condemnation. And in those moments, Father O'Reilly allowed himself to hope, to believe that somewhere, somehow, Tommy Marino, killer and confessor, sinner and penitent, had found the absolution that the priest could never give him. The rosary on Father O'Reilly's desk caught the lamplight, its melted beads glowing faintly like embers that never quite died, like a soul still burning, still seeking, still hoping for grace.